Ladies and gentlemen, this is Global Compliance Panel, and welcome to our live webinar on Pharmacovigilance Audit. My name is David Benjamin, your host for today, and on behalf of the team here, I would like to say thank you to everyone for being part of today's event. Today's presenter is Steve Jolly. Steve is a subject matter expert in all areas of global safety compliance and signal detection, and is a frequent speaker at leading industry events including DIA and MHRA. He has 25 years experience in drug safety and pharmacovigilance and has worked with over 50 clients in the United States, Europe, and Japan. He holds degrees in mathematics and computer science from Cambridge University, England, and Steve is a featured speaker with FDA at DIA conferences and webinars on auditing, signaling, and data mining. He was recently elected as chairman of the DIA's Clinical Safety and Pharmacovigilance Steering Committee for North America. Now, Steve began his career in the pharmaceutical industry in 1985 when he founded DLV Systems, a supplier of computer systems for clinical trials and adverse event reporting to many of the leading life sciences companies worldwide. Now, DLV was acquired by eResearch Technologies in 1997, and since then, Steve has worked as an independent consultant. Steve, we are really honored to have someone as distinguished as you to present today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outlined for this training session. The webinar is for 90 minutes duration. First, Steve will take you through the webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he will then share with you his presentation. We also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 to 15 minutes time towards the end of the webinar will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of the training session or the teleconference, I request you to follow the same procedure to join in again. I hope everyone is ready to start the session. I now request Steve to take it from here. Steve?
Okay, well, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. David, thanks again. I think you flattered me with your introduction. So here's another slide with me. That's enough of that, I think. Okay, let's get going. All right, the purpose of today's webinar is to talk about the pharmacovigilance audit and basically how to survive an inspection in drug safety and pharmacovigilance. And so we're going to start by painting a bit about the regulatory background, and I'm going to go over the regulations basically in the US and in Europe, okay, because that's where most companies, I think, are mainly concerned. And I would say, in fact, the European regulations are tougher in general than the American ones. So if we can comply with those, we can probably get past anything around the world. So how does it work? Well, first of all, there are some legalities. Okay, in the U.S., we have laws. So law is a written statute, requirement, ordinance, and so on, passed by legislature, signed into law by normally the president at the federal level, and you've got all the different things here. A federal law is passed by Congress, signed by the president, and the law for investigation of new drugs is there in Section 5051, and the law governing marketed drugs is there 505K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Okay, that's the law. Now, the way drug regulations tend to be enacted here in the States is basically the law, the FTC Act, empowers FDA to create and issue regulations which have the force of law, that do not have to be approved by Congress or signed by the President. Basically, the way that works is they're published in the Federal Register, okay? And once they've been published, you get a period defined during which the public can send in written comments on the proposal. And once it's been reviewed, the final regulation is published in the Federal Register and in the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. And that's how we get, CFR 21 Part 11 and so on. All the CFRs come from that. And there could be a long period between the first publishing and the final regulation. For example, the tome, which was proposed in 2003, had a ton of comments and nothing, no finalization, and no one knows if that will ever be finalized. And the draft regulation may be withdrawn. But this is the basic way of enacting regulation here in the States in terms of drug safety. There are also guidances. These are documents issued by FDA which contain their current thinking on a particular subject. It says in the preamble, these do not create or confer any rights for on any person or do not operate to bind FDA or the public. And you may propose an alternative approach. I must say I've never come across a company ever proposing an alternative approach formally. I mean, it may be informal, but certainly not formally. These may be issued as draft guidances for comment, or they're directly as final guidances. And typically, people follow them. You know, if you're trying to get a drug approved or keep it on the market, it probably makes sense to follow along with these guidances. But you can't get a 483 for a guidance. Okay, so there's some quite good guidances. For example, on signaling came out of the FDA. March 2005 guidances on good pharmacovigilance practices and pharmacoepidemiology, and so on. And they're just guidances. So it's not a bad idea to follow them, but you really don't have to. If you don't, you won't get a 483 when you're inspected. In Europe, it's quite different. You have 25 member states, which are very different to the American states. There are other countries that are not in the EU that may follow EU laws, and these laws may exist in all sorts of different languages. It's possible some national laws are only available in the national languages. You've got primary legislation and secondary legislation. The primary legislation comes from treaties and agreements among the member states, and I've listed a few there, and there's some secondary legislation. Now, in terms of the regulations here, these typically are directly applicable and binding in all the European member states without the need for any additional national implementation legislation. So the regulation, if it's a EU regulation, as it is published, it's word for word and immediately the law in each of the member states. Okay? On the other hand, you have directives. Okay, so for example, the regulation would be Volume 9A, but a directive could be the European Clinical Trials Directive. Okay, so the directive is that this legislation binds member states to the objectives of the legislation within a certain period, but allows each member state to create its own version of the law to so achieve it. So, you may find that individual countries then can come up with different variations on this theme. Okay, so the Clinical Trials Directive, the idea was to sort of harmonize clinical trials throughout the European Union, but of course individual countries implemented it slightly differently. So I'm not sure to what extent it really achieved that, but it probably did most of it. It didn't do too badly. But as I say, the problem with directives is that you can end up with differences and inconsistencies in each member state. So here's like a matrix of the different regulations. So I've got a few columns here. Let me see if I can get a little pointer going. Okay, so this column here is for clinical development. This column here is for post-marketing. And we have global, EU, and US. So global is basically ICH topics. Okay, so the ICH topic is E2A, which covers clinical safety, and E2D, which covers expedited reporting, and E2C, which is PSURs. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about ICH in a minute. As far as Europe goes, in the European Union, for clinical development, there's the European Clinical Trials Directive, which was this document here. We'll come on to that again in more detail in a second. And that was then sort of summarized, superseded by Volume 10 in Europe. For post-marketing Europe, you have Volume 9A. Okay, this is and this contains all of the things you have to do for post-marketing. In America, most of the stuff for clinical development here is in 21 CFR 312, which covers INDs, investigational new drugs. And the typical things for post-marketing, the standard drug reports, is in 21 CFR 314.80. Again, there's a few others that we're going to come on to in a bit. But that's a basic overview there of the matrix of safety regulations. And if you can follow all of those, then, that's not a bad start. Okay? There's obviously more subtlety, but that's the starting point. So let's have a look here. So just to come back to the US post-marketing safety reporting requirements, there are some additional ones. Okay, so we talked about 21 CFR 314.80, which was this one here, which is post-marketing reporting of adverse drug events. Okay, there's also 310.305, which is ADEs on marketed drugs without NDAs. Okay, so this is old drugs that came in without NDAs. Then we have this rule here for biologics. And basically, the way that reports are sent in the US reports are sent in on the MedWatch form, and non-US reports sent in on the CIOMS form, or possibly also on the MedWatch form, the 3500A form. And we also have in the States, all of these reporting is governed by good clinical practices and good pharmacovigilance practices. All right. I mentioned ICH. Okay, ICH stands for the International Conference on Harmonization. You can see that harmonization here is spelled with an S. So you can't actually harmonize the word harmonize. It's the European spelling, not the American spelling. It was formed in 1990, and the members are traditionally called the six-pack. Okay, the membership of ICH comprises both the regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical associations from the different regions. So you've got the EMA, European Medicines Agency in Europe, and EFPIA, which is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, MHLW in Japan, JPMA, which is the Japanese Manufacturers Association, obviously FDA and PhRMA here in the States. You also have observers, which includes the World Health Organization, and also, in fact, Health Canada is an observer to ICH. The principles are to develop scientific consensus and both for the regulatory authorities and for industry. And there's consultation on these various documents to try and finalize the text. And basically, once topics move through ICH, okay, you go through step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. Once we get to step 4, then there's a commitment by the regulatory authorities, certainly in Europe and US and Japan, to implement these ICH harmonized texts. And when we reach step 5, that is, in fact, the implementation thereof. The topics covered by ICH include quality, safety, efficacy, and multidisciplinary. But beware this thing. Actually, ICH safety topics are not the sort of safety we're talking about today. ICH safety is mainly preclinical safety. Okay, so the post-marketing safety, clinical and post-marketing safety, is actually a subsection of this efficacy. So, for example, most of the PV topics are an E2. We'll see that on the next slide. And here are the steps again. There are 5 steps: technical discussion, consensus, outside consultation, final guideline implementation. As I said, once a topic has reached this step, step 4, final ICH guideline, that means the regulators have agreed, or the members of the six-pack have agreed that that's what we're going to go forward with. And that will then be enacted and come out as regulation in the 3 different regions. And when it reaches step 5, that's the actual implemented text. Here are some of those topics: quality, safety. As I say, the safety there is the preclinical safety, and we have some multidisciplinary topics. M1, which is equivalent of MEDRA; M2, which talks about electronic transmission; M3, M4. Okay. And then here are the efficacy topics, and in fact, the safety ones we're concerned with are all the E2 topics, E2A through to E2F here. Okay, and these have basically all of these topics, apart from E2F. Okay, all of these topics, E2A, B, and so on, these have come out now. They've progressed through ICH and been enacted as regulations in the different regions. E2F, which is the Development Safety Update Report, is coming through at the moment. Although this hasn't yet reached step 4, actually hasn't reached step 5, hasn't been implemented yet within this framework. In fact, Japan went ahead, and they went ahead with the DSUR, a version of the DSUR, in July of last year. So that was slightly odd. Okay. We also have the CIOMS, the Council of International Organization of Medical Sciences, and CIOMS effectively works as a think tank. So the flow of events, the flow of regulations, it starts with CIOMS, it goes to ICH, and once it's come through ICH, it then goes to the different regions for final regulations. CIOMS here was established a while ago, has many members, and it has these ideas. And it started off with CIOMS 1, which is actually the form that's now used for international reporting. CIOMS 1A maps onto E2B, and so on. You can see the different topics here from CIOMS that map into different ideas. The latest thing about of CIOMS is CIOMS 8, which is how to do signaling and signal detection. Okay, let's now look at the European requirements. The key European components here are Eudravigilance, Eudract, the Clinical Trials Directive, Volume 10 and Volume 9A. And I will cover each one of these in turn. Eudravigilance is a central computer database created and maintained by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency,